Welcome to Making Sense. Today we have an amazing lady called Una McGurk, and we saw quite a bit of Una in 2020, and then she sort of disappeared behind the scenes because there was so much going on. And Una is a senior counsel. She's also worked in the human rights area. She's a criminal and justice lawyer, and has just got so much experience. It's just incredible. And today, the main thing we really want to discuss is this new criminal justice, this incitement to hatred and hate offence bill that we seem to be led to be believed is put on pause for the moment. So, Una, welcome to Making Sense.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for having me. And thank you for that very generous introduction. Thank you.
No, it's totally deserved. So, we're being told that there's a pause on this, but before we talk about, is it really paused? Is it going to be, perhaps pushed through, kind of under cover of night? These things seem to happen. We seem to think one thing and something else happens. But just generally, what are your concerns about this bill?
Okay, before I actually get into that, Sarah, I just want to make two comments, which I think are important in providing context for what we're going to talk about. I think it's axiomatic that without free speech, democracy withers. Robust debate is really essential for any kind of progressive modern society, in my view. And I find it very sad that this government, that this minister and this government have no faith in the warmth and decency of its people and feel that they must bring forward a very, draconian piece of legislation in order to curb what they perceive as being the levels of hatred that the Irish people are so capable of manifesting. In my humble opinion, and yes, I know I'm biased, I think Irish people are wonderful. I think the Irish people are the kindest, the most generous people in the world. And I've traveled a great deal, and I am dismayed that this government feels the need to bring forward legislation of this type, because as you may already be aware, we do have legislation on the statute books. We already have legislation which criminalizes hate speech. It's known as the Prohibition on Incitement to Hatred Act of 1989. Now, it has been suggested that the reason why they want to repeal that legislation, which is what they do want to do, and incorporate it into a brand new bill, is because they're concerned that they have not been getting enough convictions under the existing legislation. And there have been criticisms also that the standard of proof is too high, it's too difficult to prove intent, etc. But I find it extraordinary, and I said this in a video that I did about 7 months ago on this, that a government would want to introduce legislation because the existing legislation doesn't give them enough convictions. So why would a government want to introduce legislation which would potentially or could potentially result in more convictions against its own people?
So can I just, because, okay, the whole point of Making Sense is we're talking about something that to the ordinary person on the street doesn't make sense. There are things that are missing that, and I'm, as you can tell, I'm not Irish, but I've lived here for 20 years. And I totally agree with you, Una. The Irish are wonderful, warm, friendly people. I have a funny surname. My father's Arabic. I've never had any kind of prejudice against me because of that, or even because of my English accent, which generally just becomes a bit of a joke. But I know there's no harm in it. So I just. Can I just ask in terms of, so they're saying there's not enough convictions. Yes. How many people have actually tried to get convictions then? How many cases are there?
Do you know? Under the existing legislation, the current Hate Crime Act, which I mentioned, the 1989 Act, there have been less than 50 convictions. It's not entirely clear why there have only been 50 convictions. It could be, for example, that there have been very few complaints. Therefore, there have been very few prosecutions. Therefore, there have been very few convictions. But I don't think it's a good idea for a government to be trying to bring in new legislation because they're saying, oh my goodness, we only got 50 convictions out of the last piece of legislation. We really need to get more out of our own people. why would a government want to do that? Why would it be the reason?
Yeah, it's very strange.
It
So
is
in
strange.
terms of this new, is this an amended version of the previous
No,
bill, or is this a brand new bill that's coming in?
it's a brand new bill, you see.
And what are
That's
your
and
concerns then about this?
so what they're doing is they're essentially bringing most of the components of the existing legislation, enhancing them, bringing them into a new bill. And in this new bill, there are two components. The first one is hate speech, and the second one is a brand new offence of hate crime, which we've never had on the statute books. So I'm happy to tell you about both. So that's what they're doing. Now, it has frequently been suggested, and you've probably heard this from government ministers, that when they don't really want to have to explain something to the people, they say, oh, we have these international obligations. You know, we must do this because it's our international obligation. But mysteriously, they never actually tell you what those international obligations are. So in this instance, and I just want to make a reference to a primetime episode last Thursday, where it was suggested that we have to do this in order to meet our international obligations. Well, what I would say about that is this. First of all, we already have hate speech legislation, legislation which criminalizes hate speech on our statute books. I'm not saying it's entirely perfect. And I would accept in one respect that I have to say this. We do need to comply with a particular international obligation, which is under the EU Council Directive Framework, which relates to genocide and war crimes. So we do have to put that into effect. I accept that. But all that would be required, Sarah, is to make an amendment to the existing legislation. So that's the first point. There's no need now for new legislation. And insofar as the minister or anybody else would claim that we must do it in order to meet our international obligations, I would be obliged if somebody would specify what those legal obligations are, because if they're referring to the Council of Europe recommendations, I'm not sure that they are, but they're just recommendations that member states can follow, but they're under no obligation to follow them. So it's just what I did in my video, and I think you have seen it, was that I raised a number of questions.
We'll put the link to the video down
below.
so
Thanks very much. I
and
raised
watch.
a number of questions and issues which really have not been answered satisfactorily. So that's the situation with regard to the hate speech aspect. But there are a lot of concerns about it. Others have raised them, and indeed I have to commend and give credit to the independent senators in the Seanad who have, formed a very strong, bulwark against this legislation. And but at the end of the day, the government will probably have the numbers to see it through. And it's not clear, as you stated at the outset, whether or not the minister is actually going to push this through before the Dáil rises for the summer recess, or whether, in fact, it will go back to the autumn. But I know these senators have raised a number of concerns, and they've also tabled a lot of amendments. I don't know what those amendments are, but those amendments may relate to some of the issues that I'm raising today as well.
And I think, again, from the ordinary person on the streets point of view, it's quite scary how this just went through all of the Dáil processes without any challenges by the looks of it. It was just voted through. Nobody really said anything about it. In fact, I heard, I don't know if this is true, but I did hear that, a lot of the TDs didn't even read it, that they didn't actually read through it to really see. They were just signing it through and waving it through. And this is very scary, because particularly this new element of a hate crime. So one of the things I again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that there's very unclear, there's kind of no actual definitions of what, first of all, constitute hate or a hate crime. So there's a lot of, and obviously as a senior counsel, the whole point of any sort of legal legislation coming through is it has to be absolutely solid in terms of everyone understands, what these terms mean. Is that true? So it's very vague.
You're absolutely right about that, Sarah. The law must be certain. if there's no certainty in the law, nobody knows where they stand with regard to it. And that is particularly so in any criminal legislation, where there's a lot at stake for somebody accused of a crime under a piece of criminal legislation, where their liberty is at stake. So they're entitled to know what the law is, and that the definitions of what their behavior can be or not be, as the case may be, that they know, that they have the definitions that can define how they know how they should behave. And they don't have that, because hate
it also,
itself is not defined.
And hate is a very strong word, in the sense that you can hate a person's behavior, but it doesn't mean you hate them. And that's very subjective, and it's down to we all have our own opinions and our own values and our own cultures and our own kind of upbringing, and our expectations of civilized society, how we behave. So this idea that you can, and it seems that the onus is now you're kind of presumed guilty until proven innocent. So the onus is on you to prove that there was no, I mean, how on earth are they going to police it? Are they going to, it's obviously open then to interpretation, which is open to abuse in some way. And then thirdly, there seems to be this, again, something different, which is these very sort of special classes of people, these kind of characteristics that are protected.
In many ways, it essentially is unworkable, as I've previously stated. And as you have correctly pointed out, there is no provision for any cultural differences or nuances between people. And as you know perfectly well, and you come from a different culture, this can, be a significant factor in determining what behavior is acceptable or not acceptable, what constitutes hate, what doesn't constitute hate, what might constitute incitement to violence, what it might be for one culture, it wouldn't be for another culture. And I think that this legislation would just cause a great deal of confusion. As you've stated, there is no definition whatsoever of hate. And I think just on that aspect, before I proceed further to talk generally about the Act and the various points that you've made, I just want to make reference to an appearance by the Minister for Justice, who, as you know, is the minister responsible for bringing this legislation through. And she appeared on Prime Time last Thursday night, and she was asked a number of questions. And of course, the most significant question she was asked, which was the one we were all waiting for, was, Minister, what is your definition of hate? So can I quote what she said?
Please, I'm interested to know what she said.
Yes, she said, in her opinion, that hate is the most intense negative feeling you can have for a person. Now, that to me is quite extraordinary, because here you have a Minister for Justice effectively saying that people can now be prosecuted and suffer penal sanctions for their feelings. Something as immutable and as transient as a feeling, which can pass in a number of seconds, now becomes something for which you can be criminally liable. And this brings me to a very significant point made by the eminent Professor Gerard Casey, who has effectively proven that hate crime is thought crime. And as you know, before you have an emotion such as hate, you have to have a thought. And he has been proven to be absolutely correct, out of the mouth of the minister herself. Now, isn't that extraordinary?
Wow. So we're smack in the middle of 1984.
Yes.
Essentially. I think they always said that it turns out 1984 was actually an instruction manual, not just a novel.
That's right. Yes.
And it's very, very frightening to think how quickly we got here.
That's right. With this legislation, this minister and her government are leading us all blindfolded over a cliff into a sea of totalitarianism and potentially a totalitarian future.
And I know Gript, Ben Scallon, did ask this question as well, which was, where was the demand for this? Where did it come from? And I think there was this kind of insinuation that yes, there was definitely a demand for this. It was coming, that they. So the question is, well, where is it coming from? Who is demanding that we have this?
Exactly. And I raised that point as well in my own video, where I said, and I maintain, and I'm quite satisfied, that there is no mandate from the Irish people for this legislation. Absolutely not. But as you know, Sarah, there is a very strong connection between certain members of our government at a very high level and a very sinister organization called the World Economic Forum in Davos. We know that they go there on a regular basis. This is a very, very sinister organization which wants to bring about a one world government, a new world order. They want to introduce the concept of transhumanism. They consider that it's going to be progressive if we all can be chipped. The founder of that organization, Klaus Schwab, his most senior advisor is a doctor called Dr. Yuval Harari.
Yuval Harari, yeah.
Yuval Harari.
He's
he's an Israeli professor.
Philosopher? Is he meant to be like a professor of philosophy? I don't know. I actually don't know what his background is.
What his background is. But he has stated on a number of occasions, and I've heard this, human beings are now hackable animals. He has stated this time and time again, and I find it extraordinary that our mainstream media and the journalists who are part of that process are so lazy and they won't do their research to find out who are the influences with our government, because it's clear.
I mean, we do know that Leo Varadkar himself, I think he's either finished or just finishing his 5-year Young Global Leaders Apprenticeship. And the question I always ask about that is, first of all, the World Economic Forum is not a government. It's not funded by governments. It's a private trade organization. And it costs a lot to be a member of this organization. And who's paying for his membership, and why is he doing an apprenticeship as the highest office you can hold in Ireland? And what is his remit? What is he being told? And you see this replicated across the world with the likes of
course,
Macron and other leaders.
Yeah, and where is the accountability to the Irish people? And why are the mainstream media
on this?
Yeah, and why are the mainstream media not making our politicians accountable for their influences from these organizations? Klaus Schwab has boasted publicly about the fact that he has representatives in every government in the world. Now, this is very, very sinister and very dangerous, especially when you're dealing with legislation of this type, which doesn't come from the grassroots level up. And I'm not saying specifically this comes from the World Economic Forum, but I believe a lot of policies are being pushed forward by this organization, by the UN, which is also corrupt, and by the EU. So we
are seeing a censorship industrial complex going on internationally.
Yes. Which just and these organizations are run by billionaires and technocrats. And these are the people that are pushing forward these agendas, and they're not for the benefit of the average person. You and I, Sarah, it's all about bringing in this one world government and a new world order. And they've stated this publicly. This is not a conspiracy.
This is not a theory. It might be a conspiracy, but it's not a theory. It's a conspiracy fact.
It's a fact. It's a fact.
What's really interesting is that this entire the World Economic Forum is very much driven by this Malthusian ideology, which I just think is so shocking that for the people in Ireland, given the fact that we had the Great Hunger that was brought about by Malthusian ideology before, and the Irish suffered, that we are being yet again in this country subjected to this.
That's right.
Trying to limit, farm production, trying to limit, growth.
Everything
is being squashed. I drove past down the quays in the IFSE the other day, and there was a big sign saying your 15-minute city starts here. Big, huge letters, on a building. And I just thought, this is nuts. But if we come back to
so all these agendas are being driven by and come from transnational organizations like the ones I've just spoken about, and then they're filtered through NGOs, which get their funding from these organizations and or the Irish government. So to come back to your point about whether or not there's a mandate effectively for this from the Irish people, and I've claimed that there isn't. Ben Scallon of GRIPT actually personally did a survey of all the public representations that were made to the department, and he concluded that 73% of them were against this legislation, notwithstanding the fact that the minister continuously proclaims that there is support for this. Now, I've checked some of the other representations which were made by academics and NGOs, but almost all of them have a vested interest in this area because they represent the minority groups who have the protected characteristics, who will benefit from this legislation. And so, they're not independent. Plus, the questions that were asked in the surveys which went to these people were not open-ended questions. They were predicated on the fact that, well, we all agree that we need this legislation. So now can you tell us how we can bring it about? It's called motivated reasoning. So there were no independent questions, open-ended questions such as, do you think new legislation is necessary? And what you have to remember about these NGOs, and I'm sure some of them do very good work, but at the end of the day, if everybody is empowered in Ireland, in the country, they will all be out of a job. They will have nothing to do. And
I think we have something like 36.
Something we need to bear in mind.
Absolutely. And is it like a crazy figure, like 36,000 NGOs in Ireland, a population of
5 I've heard
million?
that, and that is absolutely outrageous because they are involved in driving a lot of this policy. These extraneous policies, whether it's transgenderism, transhumanism, which is coming down the line with the World Economic Forum, these are not policies which are coming from the grassroots level. There is no mandate for them, and this is very serious. And to come back to this legislation, what it's going to do is effectively to create a two-tier class of victims. You will have victims who are members of minority groups who have what are known as these protected characteristics. There's race, gender, descent, nationality, if you're a member of the traveling community, all of those, there's a list set out in the Act. So if you are a member of any one of those, of a minority group which has any one of those characteristics, you will be treated in the legislation differently to the rest of us. So there will be a hierarchy of justice. So in other words, what this legislation is doing effectively is saying that a crime committed against a member of a minority group who displays one of these protected characteristics is greater than a crime committed against a member of a majority group like you or me. So why should we have that if we're all supposed to be equal under the law, which we are?
And it's just, again, there's no clear definition of what these crimes even are. So, and the onus is on the person who is the accused to basically say, no, I'm innocent, which is virtually impossible because it can always be twisted. So it's just very strange that you have this thing coming in that is so could potentially be so damaging for our democracy, which has already been, as you said, it's already been impacted by these NGOs, and they seem to have the ear of the government, more than just ordinary people, that the elected officials, they don't seem to be listening to their constituents at all. There has been pushback. And I think I heard something about this one in particular, which was, they've never had, the TDs just said they've never had so much engagement with the public regarding, a bill as this. This is the one that is really, people are saying, hang on a minute, this is not what we want. This is, it's not clear. It's obviously open to abuse. We don't understand it. We don't know why we're getting it. And they just seem to be brushing that aside because obviously these very powerful NGOs and other bodies, seem to be infiltrating into this situation and really driving it forward hard. And even the article that I was reading earlier, there was still this kind of potential by the Minister for Justice, Helen McEntee. She did say, she wasn't going to squeeze anything through. She wasn't going to push it through, but she didn't close the door. It was open. The door was still open. And we've only got, a matter of days before everything closes down for the summer. So we have to still be very vigilant that this potentially could be slipped through.
Yes, absolutely. We just don't know. But it's interesting what you're saying about how the TDs have all of them, the TDs and senators, have said they've never received such a deluge of pushback from the public saying that they don't want this. And I think it's very interesting that Jim O'Callaghan, the Fianna Fáil TD, now I think he may have voted for it. I am assuming he did, because he would have been subject to the whip. But apparently he wrote an article in, I think it was the Sunday Business Post last Sunday. I didn't see it, but he expressed concern about the bill. And in fact, one of the points that I've made, which I'll tell you about in just a moment, and I have to give him full credit for doing that, even if he had voted the bill in, because I think that, that shows you how worried he is about it. And I have to give him full credit for coming out at that point to deal with it.
And just on a personal note about yourself, in 2020, I know that you had a run-in yourself with the Minister for Justice. What was that about? Can you explain a bit what happened to you?
Well, that's interesting, Sarah. Yes, I don't know if you recall, but I spoke at a public rally in 2020, August of 2020, because of my concerns regarding the government restrictions during COVID. And I spoke specifically on two issues, which I think are important. I'll just mention them very briefly. One was the mandating of the wearing of masks, which I knew was coming down the tracks for children as well. And, I'm not a doctor, but I have been involved in the area of medical negligence for a long, long time. And I was a barrister, a senior counsel of 40 years standing. I had done a lot of research, including the fact that I'd studied geopolitics. And I'm trained to evaluate evidence. So I felt I had a justifiable opinion on this. I wasn't alone, because I was quoting eminent doctors and neurosurgeons from all over the world who were deeply, deeply concerned about the fact that we were having masks. And it's very interesting that I've been essentially proven to be correct, because the Cochrane study has shown that, in fact, there is no evidence whatsoever to establish that mask wearing in any way prevented transmission. And in fact, I believe it also stated that it was responsible for the cognitive decline of children. The other area I spoke about was the area of PCR tests, which I knew was being used to justify the lockdowns. I also knew that that was a flawed test. And the man who invented the test, Kary Mullis, who won the Nobel laureate for his discovery, actually stated on video that there was no way this test was ever to be used to test for an infection. Even the CDC in the United States, who promoted the flawed PCR test, said it shouldn't be used at a magnitude above, because it's how it's processed is through magnification.
How many cycles of amplification?
Correct,
yeah.
And it shouldn't be used anywhere above 25 cycles, because if it did, then the results would be flawed. In Ireland, they were using cycles with the order of magnitude of 45 cycles. So it meant that if you had a cold 10 years ago, the chances are they would find some debris, and therefore it gave rise to a series of false positives. So I was deeply concerned that this flawed test was being used to justify lockdowns, and I said that. But of course, nobody concentrated on that. And instead, what happened was the Minister for Justice and indeed the Minister for Integration, Roderick O'Gorman, began publicly tweeting about me on a Sunday morning, the morning after I spoke at that rally. And essentially what the minister did was she called for an urgent report from the chairperson of IPAT, of which I was a member at the time. I was a part-time adjudicator in the area of international protection, which dealt with claims by asylum seekers looking for refugee status. I'm supposed to be, and I was, completely independent in the performance of my functions. So I felt I was very entitled to be at that rally, exercising my right to freedom of expression. But the minister publicly called for an urgent report. And that's unfortunately set the tone for what happened since, because the media followed suit. And essentially, there was media hysteria, literally, about what I had done, which led to me being defamed, vilified, and ultimately cancelled. And I think that, unfortunately, the standard for this was set by two high-ranking government ministers on that morning. And I think that was very unsavory and unbecoming behaviour. And certainly when the Ireland that I grew up in, senior government ministers would never behave in that way. But perhaps the most important aspect of this is that the minister had no statutory authority under the Act to call for any urgent report on me. There is a lacuna in the Act, and the Act only provides for the minister to call for a report on the functions of the chair of the tribunal. It doesn't make any reference to a member like me, and I was a member. And so there was a lacuna in the Act, and that should not have been called for, and yet it caused serious problems for me. But ultimately, what happened with the minister was that 5 months later, in January, the report was prepared and lay in abeyance. Nothing happened. It went apparently to the Attorney General's office. And in the meantime, I was suspended. And then my term of appointment was up in February. In other words, my 3-year term of appointment was up in February. Now, I should state, and I do accept, that a Minister for Justice who effectively has responsibility for this, the International Protection Appeals Tribunal. So whilst it does operate independently under the law, it's essentially under the aegis of the Department of Justice. And a minister does have the power to remove a member from office for stated reasons. Now, I do accept that. And it makes sense that those stated reasons should be in writing. But unfortunately, there's a missing piece in the legislation, and there's no power authorizing her to require the report to do that if it makes sense. But in any event, in January of 2021, I then received a letter from the minister's office. It was directed by the minister, and it sent to me by our private secretary, saying that she was thinking of not reappointing me in February. And she set out 3 reasons why she wouldn't do that. The first 2 reasons I can't deal with, because they're potentially the subject matter of proceedings I'm involved in, and therefore there's you to chase. So I can't make a reference to them. But the third reason is instructive, which is why I'm glad you've asked me about this. And if I can just find it here somewhere amongst my papers. Reference was made to the fact that she had been made aware that I had engaged in producing 2 videos, which effectively was true. One was a cancel culture video, where I had
that. Yeah, it was a great video.
Endeavoring to explain to people what was going on, because there was this media hysteria which occurred in the aftermath of this rally, which I believe was deliberately orchestrated, by the way. And then there was nothing. So people were saying, what's happened? We need to know what's happening. So I made that video to explain the situation. I was conscious that the report was still with the Attorney General, and so I didn't make any criticism of the minister or anything of that nature. But I also participated in another online forum. It was the World Intellectual Forum, where I expressed certain remarks, which I will tell you about. I didn't realize I was being recorded, but it was put up on YouTube, and it seems that I was being monitored either by the media and or the minister. But the minister became aware of the comments, what I said, and I criticized the World Economic Forum and the proposed hate crime legislation.
Which is your right.
Well, I actually thought in my innocence that, yes, I had the right to freedom of expression it was a constitutional right that I had. So what the minister said was, and I think this is what really, really concerns me, is that, and it states, and I quote, "The minister is concerned that your comments as quoted above in relation to hate speech legislation is contrary to government policy in an area for which she herself is responsible." So in other words, what she's saying is, if you want to be on a tribunal of which I have control, you must agree with my legislation. You must agree with the government. Now, what's extraordinary about that is that I and all the members of the tribunal were supposed to be completely independent in the performance of our functions, which means we're not supposed to be influenced even by the government. And here is a government minister effectively stating, you're not agreeing with my legislation, and therefore I don't like it, and I don't want you on my tribunal. Now, how extraordinary is that?
What?
Especially when
That
we
is
have this minister
unbelievable.
going around to all these media outlets trying to convince people that her legislation respects the principle of freedom of expression. And here she has effectively done the opposite. So I think, actions speak louder than words.
Absolutely. That is truly shocking. That,
Yeah,
first of all, she said it, but secondly, it's in writing.
it's in writing.
That she's
It's in
actually put
writing.
this in writing. This is not
Yeah.
hearsay. This is actually
No, it's in writing. It's in writing. So the concept
holy
of having
hell.
freedom of expression is not, it seems it's not in this minister's playbook, really, when push comes
And
to shove.
she's claiming that this is going to strengthen free speech, not hinder it.
Yes. Yes.
Whereas in actual fact, I mean, it is completely the opposite. She's demonstrating completely. And I'm actually a bit speechless. I'm actually a bit speechless about that. I can't believe. I mean, we sort of all have this sense that this is hypocritical. We all have this sense that this is coming from somewhere else, that this is not. But really, to actually have our own Minister for Justice to behave in this way is completely and utterly inexcusable, and really shows then the danger of, if this bill is passed, that it will be a full totalitarian state where someone like her can literally, have you kicked off a job or not kind of reappointed simply because you disagree with what she says.
And I believe what happened to me really had a chilling effect on a lot of my colleagues, and indeed other academics and other professionals. But it doesn't matter really that this happened to me, and I'm not really speaking about it on that basis, but
no,
this could have been anybody. Yeah, this could have been any citizen of the state. And this is the attitude of a high-ranking Minister for Justice, who is currently now bringing through legislation and who's attempting to give the idea that the concept of freedom of expression is respected. But like there are other aspects of we have to talk about, like Section 15, are very, very worrying. If you have in your possession material that someone considers is likely to incite violence or hatred, and it could be anything. It could be a scientific report which states or establishes that the transgender ideology is a satanic ideology, which is for the purpose of mutilating children, sterilizing them, and further bringing the West, making it descend further into decadence,
chaos.
and
chaos and depopulation as well. It's a great way.
And if you had something like that in your possession, or you received a post on WhatsApp and you wanted to send it to somebody else, that clearly would upset those in the woke movement, the woke transgender movement, who are have the protected characteristics under this legislation. So if any of them were to complain about the fact that anybody had this kind of information, you can take it that they would definitely disagree with this, and they might find it offensive, and they could say that it's liable to incite hatred against them. What could happen in a situation like that? And I accept it may be an extreme example, but this is where the legislation leaves itself open in the current climate. That someone who complains to a member of An Garda Síochána, it could be just some new Garda that's recruit that's straight out of Templemore, and he then, if he thinks there's a reasonable cause to do so, he can go to a district court judge and he can get a warrant to search the premises of the person they think might have this offensive material, which could be likely to incite violence or hatred against a group containing or having protected characteristics. And the powers given to that member under the Act are quite extraordinary. It's Section 15. They can use reasonable force to gain entry to your house. When they come in, They can ask you for, they can examine any material that they so require to examine on your computer, on your phone. They can insist that you give them passwords, and if you don't do any of that, you're potentially liable to the commission of an offence. If anyone else is in the house with you, they can also demand the same information of them. So if you're having a meeting in your house, or you're having a dinner party or any kind of a party, technically they can come knocking on the door and demand this information from anybody. If you don't provide it, you're guilty of an offence. And they can take away that property from you. And as I know from my experience as a criminal lawyer, you know, that can remain, you know, out of sight for a long time, and it can take quite a while to get your property back once it's been taken away by the members of the Garda Síochána. That effectively could be somebody's livelihood, because so many of us now, you know, rely for our work, you know, by using computers and our phones. It's part of the new paradigm of working. So to lose your hardware equipment in an investigation, which may not even be a legitimate, I'm not saying it wouldn't be a legitimate investigation, but the complaints that give rise to the investigation might not even be legitimate. They could be made up. And so I think these powers are definitely excessive. And I would have
certainly open
about that.
Wide open to abuse. I think this is the chilling effect, is that, and
Yes.
Also, of course, then a lot of what's happening is there's a lot of self-censorship is going to happen, where people are so afraid, you know, that this, it hasn't even gone through yet. I know we're at the final sort of stages, and it's supposedly being on pause, you know, it's paused at the moment and everything else. But you can almost, you know, there's so much awareness of this now, and people saying, you know, you could be put in prison for 5 years, you could be, you know, that this will actually effectively, people are going to do the job of the Minister for Justice for them, which is to self-censor, to be tiptoeing on eggshells around people, and that's not good for society. You know, you want a cohesive society.
You're absolutely right, Sarah.
You don't want people being, because this is actually going to divide us. This is not going to unite people in any way, shape, or form. And it does feel like this is, you know, divisive in its intent. It does feel like, and this is not going to protect anybody. In fact, I think you even said in your video, you know, those protected classes, categories of people, you know, there could end up being a lot of resentment towards them, which actually would put them in even more danger. You know, It's going to highlight, and it's just bonkers. It just seems completely and utterly bonkers. And we have to understand the big picture here.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. This legislation is definitely going to have a polarizing effect on society, and already people are starting to self-censor, because so they might think one thing, but they're afraid to say it because, gosh, oh my God, you know, can I say that? And what happened? Will somebody take offense? Will somebody complain about me? Will I get a knock on the door someday from a member of the Garda Síochána? It's also going to drive a wedge between people and the Garda Síochána, many of whom want to work with the community and within the community. So is it going to be a situation where you see a Garda car drive up outside the door and you freeze because you think, oh my God, what was that last WhatsApp post I sent? You know, could I be in trouble? Does he or she have a warrant for my arrest? You know, and so these are the kinds of chilling effects that such legislation could have. And I know, I'm sure the members of the Garda Síochána don't want this either, because many of them, especially in rural areas, they want to work with the local people. They pride themselves in that. That's community policing is really where it's at. And I think this will drive a wedge between the people and the members of the Garda Síochána. It will have a polarizing effect. You'll have parents saying, oh, I don't want you to play with that person over there because, you know, they're one of those minority group people. And, you know, if anything goes wrong, you say anything or I say anything,
absolutely,
there could be trouble. So children will get divided. And as you say, we need to be united. I mean, we have enough issues in the world at the moment. There's enough stress economically and every other way affecting people. So being united is essential for us. And it seems to me as well, and you've indicated it also, that this legislation is designed to drive a wedge between people and to polarize people. And I know people, I think I may have said this, who are members of this protected characteristics, they're gay people, they don't want special treatment. They don't
No,
want to
I
be
mean,
in a
the
hierarchy of
whole,
victims. Yes,
and the whole fight for many years was about equal rights. It wasn't about,
equality.
I mean, we're 1984 and we're Animal Farm here, aren't we? All animals are created equal, but some are more equal than others.
Equal than others,
No.
yes.
So I think there was a lot of foreshadowing going on with the literature that we've
Indeed,
we've read
indeed.
going through school.
What,
Una,
what,
this
what
is
they call a predictive programming.
yeah, absolutely predicted. Oh, completely. Una,
Yeah,
this has been a really, really fascinating discussion. We could probably talk for another hour, but
for
we try and
hours,
keep
yes.
this we try and keep this within a short enough period. But I think everything
Sure.
you've said, people really have to think, very carefully. And even those, as you said, underneath those protective categories, need to think really, really long and hard as to what impact it's going to have on them. And
Yes.
reality is, we all need to get together and to say absolutely categorically, a big fat no to this. I don't
Yeah,
know what we can
because,
do at this stage, but I do think that we do need to have our voices heard regarding this.
sure, because what's needed is empowerment for minority groups. And they
Yeah,
need to be empowered. But part of the empowerment process is that they will feel equal, not different,
not
or
different.
not in a
Absolutely.
category which could result in them being resented.
But we're seeing this, as you've mentioned already, this whole
Yeah.
trans ideology, it's elevating, children have to be tiptoed around in school. And I know this,
Mm-hmm.
from firsthand, with my own child, where, that he said something and it wasn't anything to do with their gender identity. It was something else. And he was told that this was Garda level serious. These are 13-year-olds. And you're thinking, this is bonkers. I mean, the Gardaí should be actually focusing on actual crimes,
Yes.
not thought crimes. And as you said, for Minister of Justice Hannah McAtee to say this was about feelings, is really, really scary, because they're transient, they can be gone in a flash, and we cannot live our lives being dictated to by, is that a good feeling or a bad feeling? Your feelings are your feelings. That's what comes up. And whatever story, and this is not gonna help those feelings. This is gonna make those feelings, worse. So
Exactly. It's not going to get rid of them. And in an enlightened society where we want to have progressive policies and progressive legislation, we would want to enact policies that would help people that have this hatred, if indeed they have it at all. I haven't really seen any evidence of it or heard of it, and I don't believe it is as prevalent as is being proposed.
I would agree with you. I don't really see it. People claim it because of a tweet or because of a message or because, at the end of the day, if this goes through, comedy's dead. You'll never be able to make a joke.
And you
I
can't
mean,
legislate. You can't legislate for an emotion. It's not going to go away. If anything, the legislation and penal sanction as a result of a potential prosecution and or an incarceration will only make that person feel even more hatred. So it just simply doesn't make sense on any level, whether it's a legal level, whether it's an emotional level, a psychological level, or a social level.
absolutely not. And then to find out, on just as the cherry on the cake, to find out that the minister herself, is actually a hypocrite in her statement that this is going to enhance free speech, it's not going to inhibit it in any way, and then to actually claim in black and white, in writing, that because you don't agree with her, that is why she's not recommending you to renew your contract. And I just think that is just,
and I just want to say one thing about that, which I just think is instructive. In my role as a chair in IPAT, I frequently, as did all of my colleagues, had to deal with claims by asylum seekers stating that their fundamental rights and freedoms were not being honoured or not respected in their country of origin, which is why they were fleeing to Ireland, and that their right to freedom of expression was not being honoured, and that they were being persecuted by the authorities. And I, as an independent adjudicator, have had on numerous occasions to adjudicate upon those issues in making a recommendation as to whether or not somebody was entitled to refugee status. And here I was in my own country, exercising my right to freedom of expression, and I was vilified, I was defamed, I was cancelled. There was a media frenzy whipped up in relation to me in order to cancel me. And in many ways, that originated with 2 senior government ministers tweeting against me, and the then Taoiseach on the Claire Byrne show saying that he felt it was inappropriate that I was speaking at that rally. So they deflected. This was just a way of deflecting from the issues that I spoke about, which would have challenged the government narrative at the time. So I challenged the government narrative, and it was made clear to me on many, many levels that I, as a senior counsel, was not allowed to exercise my right to freedom of expression in relation to these issues. But bizarrely, I was supposed to adjudicate upon it with regard to people appearing before me.
Well, I can see, asylum Irish people leaving Ireland to become asylum seekers elsewhere, if this goes through. And, we really, really can't let that happen. We need to bring Ireland back, to the country. I've been here 20 years, and this is not the same country that I moved to, I have to say.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think those of us who are of a certain age, shall we say, we can definitely see the differences, and they're not positive differences, unfortunately. I don't think any one of us would consider them to be positive. But
no, and I think
anyway,
my recommendation to everybody is always this: look, figure out how to just reduce that level of fear inside of you of what will other people think. To really become really, really grounded in yourself, to be really true and authentic to yourself. And, obviously, if you're going to say something that's defamatory, or, it is going to be, inciting hatred or violence in particular, that's just a civilized society, that we don't just say, whatever we want to say, whatever comes into our head. We have to have some sort of filter on what we're saying. However, if we are literally not being true to ourselves, and we are, speaking, contrary to what we really believe, or not saying anything at all, just standing by and just, censoring ourselves completely, that means we're all in this together, and we will all end up pushing this forward. So we all have to come back and go, hang on a minute. We have a fundamental right to free speech. And I think one of the things that kind of they again, it's that thing of deflecting. It's like they say free speech means you can just say whatever you like and you can just insult people. And it's like, no, that's not the purpose of free speech. It's debate. It's robust discussions. It's analyzing things. It's finding the way forward together. It's not being dictated to.
Yes, indeed.
So, Una, I know you're coming to our next event, the Think Local Festival in July, and this is the cornerstone of what the festival is about. It's about being able to have robust debates and discussions, and so I'm going to give it a plug for anyone who's watching this as well to come along and to have this experience. I mean, it's so wonderful to hear debates, and to not everyone has to agree, but we can be respectful, and we can talk about things in a calm and let's just not get carried away with censorship, with opinions that are based on just feelings, not on facts, and to really sort of get back to a little bit of reality again.
Yeah.
So, Una, thank you so much for being on Making Sense today. Hopefully, well, it still doesn't really make sense, but hopefully we'll shed.
No, but I think it's good to talk about it, you see, because this is about, sharing and airing alternative views about this. And I do think this is really important, so that we can find a way through this, ultimately making sense. But it's important that we just don't always follow the government's guidelines, because it's not clear where they're really coming from in this. Absolutely. And indeed many other matters. That's subject matter
it's
for another
great
day.
to see you. It's great to see you, because I saw you at that rally. I thought you spoke absolutely one such passion, and it's great to see you back. So I'm sure we're going to see a lot more of you.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. I really appreciate that, and thank you very much for having me on.
Not at all. Una, take care of yourself, and we will see you soon. And thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Okay, God bless. Namaste.
Namaste.